Welcome to the Berdis Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/FireDistimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. The Berdis Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Youssef. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone, so this is a conversation with Malaika. She's the author of the book The Three Mothers, How the Mothers of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped the Nation. The book is about the lives of Berdis Baldwin, Louise and Alberta King. So this was a conversation that was primarily about this book, but as with every episode, we sort of took it in different directions. And this is a rather special episode because by total coincidence, it wasn't actually planned. This is the 100th episode. I felt it was quite moving that on the 100th episode of the podcast, which is after all named after one of James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, we got to talk about his mother, Berdis Baldwin, along with the mothers of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Louise and Alberta King, respectively. So in this conversation we spoke about why their stories matter, how writing about them was difficult because of their famous sons and the risk of their fame eclipsing the lives of Berdis, Louise and Alberta. And we also spoke about how Anna she wasn't just writing a biography of these three women, but also contextualizing their lives in this long history of struggle as Black women. And what's also kind of very special is that Anna became a mother while writing a book about Black motherhood. So obviously we spoke about that as well. So that's it for me, folks. There was a slight issue with the audio on my side, not on Anna's side this time around. But I did my best in the editing to reduce any kind of noises and that sort of thing. So it shouldn't really bother much. But I just wanted to apologize in advance for that. It won't happen again. So thanks again, folks. Thank you for listening and take care.
Hi all, my name is Malaika, and I am the author of The Three Mothers, How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation.
Well, thanks a lot for doing this. As it happens, this is the 100th episode of the podcast.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a podcast that's named after one of Baldwin's books, The Fire Next Time, which is one of my favorite books, obviously. And as it happens, we postponed and everything, so you can testify that this wasn't really planned. This is the 100th episode. We're going to talk about Louise Little, Berdis Baldwin, and Alberta King. So let's just introduce us to the book. Who are they, and why did you want to tell their story?
Definitely. So the book is equally about celebrating them as individuals, as well as thinking about what their stories represent for Black womanhood, especially in the United States. And so each of them individually had these incredible lives that really deserve attention. And we should have known these stories already, especially with the amount of celebration that their sons receive and the amount of reverence. And especially in these three cases, their mothers' lives were important, not only in birthing their children, but also in translating their own passions, their own talents, their own skills into their mothering. And their sons take from those lessons and share them with the world. So Alberta King was somebody who believed in social justice being intertwined with her faith. She was raised by two religious leaders, the leaders of Ebenezer Baptist Church. She believed that you had to stand up against oppression, against poverty, against discrimination. And if you were privileged enough to have an education, it wasn't something that you just kept to yourself, but instead you used to advance a freedom cause forward. So all of these things that we celebrate MLK Jr. for, it's not something that he came up with on his own. Instead, he's following in the path of his mother's footsteps, his father's footsteps, his maternal lineage of freedom fighters who have kind of perfected these strategies around marches and around boycotts. So the fact that we don't know her name, more generally is really a crime and something that I wanted to correct. Then we can think about Louise Little. I'll save Berdis till the very end since this podcast is celebration of James Baldwin. I'll save his mom till the very end. But Louise Little is Malcolm X's mother. And she believes in much more of a radical approach to Black freedom. She believes in Black independence, and Black pride by any means necessary. And so she's actually a Marcus Garvey follower. So there are direct connections between the Marcus Garvey movement and the Nation of Islam, in the sense of, by any means necessary, you stand up to your oppressor. You do not assimilate. You do not depend on them for anything. So Louise Little believes this long before Malcolm X is even a thought in her mind. This is actually how she meets her husband, Earl Little, because they are both organizers and part of this UNIA movement happening around the world. And then thirdly, Berdis Baldwin, who is born in this small town called Deal Island, Maryland. She is someone whose life begins with tragedy. She loses her mother at a very young age. Either her mother passes away in childbirth or within weeks of Berdis being born. I just know that her death certificate says she passed away by a blood hemorrhage. So in my most educated guess, it's something that's related to childbirth. And in this moment of pain, Berdis actually becomes somebody who's really focused on healing and seeing the light and finding love despite some of the hardest things that can happen. And she is a writer. So she receives an education. She's able to write beautifully. And so through her kind of perfection of words, she gifts letters to all of her loved ones, explaining to them how they can change their perspective on some of the harsher realities of what they're going to experience as human beings, and uses her work to help guide them through that pain, to help them see the world from this light of love and finding healing and confronting pain and confronting the darkness so that you can move forward and progress. So that's the three of them. And by kind of reclaiming their stories and making sure they're a part of our conversations in the same way that their sons are, I'm also making a claim that we need to pay attention to Black women's stories. We need to pay attention to mothers' stories, all of these contributions that are overlooked and unappreciated. It's time to correct that and have a much more representative discussion around how we've arrived, not only as a nation in the US, but as a world where we are today.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of this, you yourself became a mother while writing this book, right?
Yes, I did.
So, I mean, can you talk a bit about that? Like, obviously, I would imagine a lot of emotions, a lot of thoughts.
There's definitely a lot to say about it. I'll try to summarize as much as I can. So yes, when I started writing the book, I wasn't a mom yet. I just really wanted to honor my own mother. She was an incredible mom who always stood for women's rights, both in the US as well as abroad. And I wanted to follow in those footsteps, as well as add to what she taught me from my experiences in undergrad and in my master's program and in my starting my PhD in sociology. And I also wanted to just make sure that more people were paying attention to the role of motherhood. And in the middle of doing this research and writing this book and finishing my dissertation for the PhD, I and my husband found ourselves expecting our firstborn. And so it all took on a very new meaning and a much more kind of profound meaning, that I was also going to get to know these three women from this perspective of what it's like to expect your child and to be pregnant in the United States as a Black woman, and to know the dangers of that, that I would be faced with biases when I entered any kind of healthcare system, that I might not be listened to during my labor, that if both myself and my child survived the pregnancy and the birth, that there were all of these other complications and dangers that would await my children as well as myself. And so in studying the three women, I also felt this kind of, I describe it as like a warm hug, that I wasn't alone in these feelings of fear, and that I also needed to reclaim my agency in this process and to not see it as this kind of inevitable burden that I had to carry as a Black woman, but instead to say, there's so much fight within me, and it will continue to be that way. And I can reclaim the joy and the love, and that being an important part of the fight, that I wouldn't allow fear to be the main part of my experience as a Black mother, but instead to be joyful, to be excited, to find other Black women to support me. So I had doulas with me throughout my pregnancy, as well as in the hospital when I gave birth to my son. So all of these things I became much more aware of because I was also studying these three women at the same time. And they continue to teach me about my motherhood, and I think they will as my children age. I now also have a 4-month-old. My son, who I was pregnant with while writing the book, is 2 years old. And I'm now, thinking about that. All three women were also mothers to several other children, not just the famous sons that we know about.
Yeah, and also, like, actually, speaking about that, yeah, as you said, I mean, everyone knows the names of their sons. The sons are very famous, obviously, especially Martin Luther King, but Malcolm X and James Baldwin as well. Were you sort of worried while writing this book that, like, this? I don't know how to ask the question, but, like, were you sort of worried that you're trying to give them back agency in many ways? You're trying to fight back against this erasure. We're sort of worried that, well, their sons are just too famous that the erasure will happen anyway, or something like that.
There were a lot of kind of moments where I thought, oh, am I doing this the right way? If I'm trying to fight the erasure of Black women, should it be a book that's focused on these three famous men? What is that message that I'm sending in that sense? But I realized I also was aware that I wanted as many people as possible to read this book, a book that was going to celebrate Black womanhood, Black motherhood in ways that it hadn't been celebrated before. I wanted it to be part of kind of this like a classic book that people could go to if they wanted to learn more about Black feminism. They wanted to learn more about Black women's history. And so I was very strategic in choosing these three men because I knew people want books about these men, and they will continue to want books about the three of them. We'll probably see another 10 books written about each of them in the next 20 years or so. And so I thought, okay, I can also add to that canon of literature and hook people in who might not have otherwise picked up the book, and then they will still leave knowing the stories of three Black women. So whatever it is that brings them to the book, whether it's the interest in the sons or people who would have picked it up if it was about a Black woman and a Black mother of any other freedom fighter, I still would have more people knowing Alberta King, Berdis Baldwin, Louise Little, as well as why it's important for us to understand Black women's stories on the whole. So I kind of thought, okay, that's a sacrifice that's worth making in order to kind of amplify the reach of the goal of the message.
No, that's fair enough. I'm hoping to write a book about Baldwin one day, and
Oh yeah.
I may add to that canon, but we'll see. You in the beginning, in the intro, you quote three scholars. Let me get their names: Akasha Hall, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith, who say that the very act of framing what you're doing, for example, as Black women's studies, is charged with political significance. Can you walk us through this? Like, how so? And also, can you talk about some of the influences in writing this book, other than the three mothers, obviously?
Yeah, there are so many. So I often say, people ask me how long it took me to write this book. And it's a hard answer because technically when I decided it was going to be these three women, it was kind of 3 years between that proposal and the end and kind of finished copy of the book. But quite honestly, there's so much more that goes into it. And what I studied as an my life experiences first, but then I studied as an undergrad, my master's in gender studies. So there's all of these influences that are from Black feminist scholars. So the book is kind of filled with these shout outs to the writers who have inspired me, whether that's Alice Walker or Melissa Harris Perry or Brittany Cooper or Margot Lee Shetterly or Isabel Wilkerson. So there's definitely this kind of rich, you can even look at it in the references database of Black women's voices that I am calling on and that I am kind of saying I'm in conversation with through this book. So those are kind of my primary inspirations outside of the three women. And this notion of even studying Black women being political, there's a lot of ways in which we could answer that, but one of the primary ones is thinking about the fact that so often Black women who want to study other Black women are told, oh, that seems like a personal project,
Right.
or,
Yeah.
why are you trying to do that? How is that something that fits within the academy, or is kind of worthy of academic study, even?
Yeah.
And for those of us who say, number one, why are you never questioning white men who want to study other white men? That's one question. And the second is, why are our stories not worthy of being kind of analyzed and presented as important parts of our world history? And even for me, specifically within sociology, why would a project focused on Black women not be seen as one that's just important as another that maybe quotes Marx for the
Mm.
5,000th time? So it's a political decision that you're making because the world makes it that way. We're told at every turn that Black women's stories are not as important. Again, it's part of that erasure. So we're making a political statement when we say, I am going to study Black women. I am going to make the claim that Black women matter,
Mm.
and should be treated, and their voices should be heard, in the same vein and with the same respect as these other sociological scholars that we've quoted dozens, thousands of times.
Yeah, like James Baldwin would always say this. It's like the what gets erased actually reflects a lot on the reasons behind those erasures. So like the erasure itself says a lot about society, which obviously a lot of this book is by default about. You're telling stories that are erased or are forgotten or whichever terms we want to use, all of the above. And yeah, I can see how this becomes political by default. And at the same time, the fact that it's political by default is worthy of questioning at the
Yeah.
same time. And there's something that you do early on, and here I'll just give some trigger warning for listeners. You may skip a couple of minutes if you want, uh, because I'm going to mention rape. I think it's in the story of Louise Little, if I'm not mistaken, but you do this with the others as well. So Louise Little, Malcolm's mother, you bring up two events before and after her birth, respectively. So I have the story here. So the story of Anna Simpson, a black woman who was raped in 1850 near Cape Town, where the perpetrator avoided the death sentence when it was revealed that his victim wasn't quote unquote a respectable woman, i.e., a white woman. And the story of Ressie Taylor in Alabama, almost 100 years to the date later, so in 1944, who was assaulted and raped by six white men, none of whom were indicted. Um, and yet, I found it interesting because you were talking about Edith, who, if I'm not mistaken, is Malcolm's grandmother, so
Mhm.
Louise's mother. Can you talk about Edith and about also this choice to sort of contextualize her birth, for example, or at least, yeah, contextualize her birth?
Yeah, it's actually, this is a great question to kind of think about some of the complexities that come up with this type of biographical research, because
Yeah.
everything I'd looked up, that was available online, and there was very little about these women that I say that over and over again in the book, that so much of this is original research. It was not available to the public before this book.
Yeah.
But a lot of the few things that were out there that were about Louise said that she was the product of rape.
Mm.
And at some point, Malcolm X says something to the extent of, I kind of, this is paraphrasing, I'm not verbatim, but that I hate the fact that I am the product of white rapist blood, is like the
Mm.
kind of
Mm.
words that he uses. And so throughout our understanding of Malcolm, we've assumed that this meant that his mom, who had very light skin, was somehow the product of rape. But in my interviews with family members, they said that was not the case. He was speaking more generally about the fact that he had white blood within his family, and that it might have been a rumor that because she was so light skinned as compared to her other family members, that maybe this was something that had happened, but it wasn't actually confirmed. And they actually believe that it's not the case at all, because she, Louise Langdon Norton Little, carries the last name of her father, who
Mm.
by records would have been Edward Norton. So they don't
Mm.
believe she would have carried that name had it actually been as a result of this awful kind of
Mm.
tragic
Mhm.
experience. So as a researcher, there's no way that I can say what exactly happened, but I can still use that as an opportunity to comment on the fact that Black women so often throughout history, not only in the US, but all over the world, have been subject to this kind of sexual control and sexual violence that leads to cycles and cycles of pain. And it, at least because in our general discussions of his mother, this notion of rape by a white man used against a Black woman's body comes up in conversation, it was still important for me to address that without saying that this was 100% what happened. So it's a strategy of the research to still be able to comment on the larger thing that's happening without saying that I know 100% for sure that this is fact in history, because I think too many times biographers have done that where they're actually not positive, but in order to tell a cooler story, they would do it in that way and just kind of say that's what happened. And I wanted to be careful in not repeating that mistake and telling inaccuracies. And that's why I sometimes make educated guesses and make it very clear rather than going with what others have done in the past, which is presenting an educated guess as fact. I say, I am saying this, or we can imagine this, but I cannot tell you 100% that that was reality based off of
Yeah,
different sources.
yeah, of course. And I mean, and it's very important because I mean, it may not have happened to her, but as you said, it did happen to so many others, and it is a good opportunity to mention that. And speaking of like being the skin color, there's a story that you mentioned of like Louise kind of telling, I don't know, I forgot what it is exactly, so feel free to correct me if that's okay, but like telling Malcolm not to overthink the fact that he is of a lighter skin than some of his siblings, something along those lines.
Yeah. That it was really big for Louise. She knew that she was, light enough that she could pass if she'd
Mhm.
wanted to. But this is something that actually really angers her because she's very proud to be a Black woman.
Mm.
And she wants to make sure that people know this about her so that she doesn't think she's better than anyone else because she's light skinned. She doesn't want to reproduce these notions of colorism. And so Malcolm is her son, who is also lighter than a lot of his siblings. And so he makes the comment that he always felt that she was harder on him because he was lighter, and that she would say things like go get in the sun, like get some color. And she wanted to make sure he didn't have this kind of superiority complex because he had lighter skin. Again, that's not something that we can say is fact. It's possible that Malcolm X this was his opinion of how his mother treated him. There's a lot of other reasons why she might have been harder on him. He was
Right.
kind of more of the rebel of the group. He didn't really listen to her when she would say, don't do this, don't do that. We know that when his father passed away, he turned to shoplifting. This was one of the ways in which he
Mm.
expressed his kind of grief by acting out in these ways. So it's also possible that she was harder on him because he was a little bit more stubborn than his siblings. But he does say in his autobiography that he thought it was because he was lighter than the rest of his siblings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of Louise, she was born in Grenada, which I don't know if a lot of people know this, but it's such an important part of the story. You didn't mention it a bit before, but can you talk a bit more about that history and how inevitably it would have impacted Malcolm, but more importantly for our conversation, how it impacted Louise?
Yeah, so Grenada's history is really incredible, and one that I didn't know that much about before I started writing this book. But I do think it's very cool that a lot of readers have said they really appreciate that first chapter because
Mm.
while I'm saying that the lives of the sons don't start when the sons are born, it starts so much sooner. It's the same thing I'm saying about the women in that
Yeah.
first chapter. We also need to know what came before the day they were born and how not only their families influence them, but the cities that they're born in, the places that surround them are going to influence their lives and their decisions. And so, especially 100% with the revolutionary history that is in Grenada, and we have an example of this through not only the kind of Arawaks and the native peoples of Grenada who are fighting against colonization at every turn. We also see it with the amount of kind of liberated Africans that are within Grenada and kind of keep this spirit alive of resistance, as
Mhm.
well as with Fadan's rebellion who is this freedom fighter, radical fighter, who actually kept white European soldiers hostage for several weeks in his attempt to reclaim Grenada. And all of these are things that she being Louise, would have grown up hearing, not only from her own family members, but from others who were, part of the Arawak lineage, or even hearing the stories of those who this mountain is called Leaper's Hill, because when Europeans were coming to colonize and enslave the people of this island, they decided instead they would rather jump to their death than to kind of serve their oppressor as slaves. And so they jump from this hill, it's called Leaper's Hill, to their death in the water as this final statement that we will not bow down, and over our dead bodies will you gain control of our home. And Louise really follows in these footsteps. I often say that if you're somebody who likes to study these kind of radical, badass women like Assata Shakur, for instance, Louise is within this, and this she would have proudly said that herself, that this is the kind of fighter that she is. She is courageous, probably also experiences fear, but turns that fear into these bold actions and statements against white supremacy.
Yeah. So speaking of that as well, like the chapters, I usually don't pay attention that much to chapter title, but these were very distinctive in many ways. So I'll just read them out for our listeners. I wrote them here. So the circumstances of our birth, the denial of our existence, our men and marriages, the birth of our children, our trials, tribulations, and tragedies, loving our sons, losing our sons, the circumstances of our death, and finally, our lives will not be erased. So, of course, the book isn't a memoir, but it has this memoir-like qualities. And I'm curious if you can kind of talk to us about this decision to use the we, and yeah, like why did you do it?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I was trying to, this is sort of part of my second goal, where that first goal is in celebrating them as individuals and not reducing their stories into categories around Black womanhood, because that happens so often when Black women are represented. It's as if we are a monolith, as if we're all the same, and one thing one of us does is representative of all of us. And that's so dehumanizing. So I didn't want to reproduce that. I wanted to make sure that this was a celebration of three unique women with beautifully rich, diverse stories, and what that means, again, for Black womanhood as a whole. But I also had this second goal of saying, again, what do their stories tell us about Black womanhood? And how sad is it that their experiences, even though they're so different from each other, they come from different backgrounds, different places, they have very different, access to resources even, but they're still in many ways treated similarly in the United States because they are Black women. And these titles is a kind of nod to that we are all a part of this story. We are all Black women who are experiencing these treatments in the US by varying degrees. But this is kind of what Black women will go through in the United States. What these titles are sort of these markers for our lives. And there were moments where it was really difficult for me to say our in the title, especially as I got to the chapter on losing our sons. Yeah. And I was cringing, thinking, oh, if it's only, it can, this chapter, maybe I can just title it something else. I don't want to even think about that. But it's also to say that Malcolm, Martin, and James were our sons as well, in that way, that they were a part of our entire community. And that loss should be felt at that personal level. We shouldn't become numb to it because we see Black mothers losing their children so often in the media. It should be something that each and every time we feel like one of our own has been taken from us, because we need to start fixing things rather than thinking that Black mothers should just inevitably experience this and they should do this on their own. And we need to hear what they're going to say for us and the whole country and how they're going to help us move forward, rather than saying, what are we all going to do to help keep this from happening to other Black mothers in the future. So it's definitely to kind of pull more people into it and say, let's try as best as possible to walk in their shoes, to experience this on the most human level possible, rather than as a detached observer.
Yeah, yeah. Honestly, it still marks me to this day, and this is something that Baldwin, like James Baldwin, mentions quite a lot. Um, that like neither Malcolm X nor Martin Luther King even made it to age 40. They both died at age 39.
Yeah.
Somehow, I don't know, when one thinks of history, we sort of age them a bit more, but they were actually just in their 30s in the end. And Baldwin, like James Baldwin, was a few years older than them, but he really outlived them until his 60s, of course.
Yeah.
But in case of their mothers, they outlived all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Malcolm's mother, Alberta, outlived him, and then herself would be assassinated 6 years later. Louise Little outlived Malcolm by quite a significant margin. She died about 30 years ago in 1991 at the age of 97.
Yeah.
And of course, James Baldwin's mother also outlived him by a few years, I believe. I actually don't have the date of when she passed away. But
1999.
okay, and yeah, he died in 1987. So yeah, can you talk? You already mentioned it a bit, so feel free to expand on that. This loss, especially, I would say, or I would guess, the losses of Malcolm and Martin, because it was at such a young age. What do they know of how it affected their mothers, and what can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, it is tragic. And I kind of start even the introduction, making sure the reader knows that their worst fears are going to become reality. All three of these moms will outlive their
Mhm.
sons. And we need to kind of keep this pain close to our heart as we're progressing through these chapters, because that is the history we are more aware of. We know that all three of them, well, more in the case of Martin and Malcolm, but even with James Baldwin, passes before his time. There is so much
Mhm.
stress that's put on his body, for all the freedom fighting work that he performs on behalf of all of us. So I don't think he's as far removed from the ways in which we lose Malcolm and Martin as some of us would think.
Mhm.
But yes, all three mothers outlived their sons. And we see more of this from the perspective of people around Alberta and around Louise, because again, part of the erasure is that we don't really have firsthand accounts from the women of how they felt about things or how they were interpreting situations. So there is a caveat to that. And I do as much as I can to add what it would maybe be like as a Black mother myself, to fill in some of those blanks, because
Yeah,
so often when people are observing Black women, they will say, wow, she's so strong. This
yeah.
strong Black woman trope that
Mhm.
Black women can carry more weight than other people or withstand more pain than other people. And so by those accounts, everyone writes that Alberta King, when her son is murdered, she is strong and she's holding it together for the family, and she is now supporting her grandchildren who have lost their father. And actually, she loses two sons,
Mhm.
within a year of each other. And I think that there's more to that. Throughout her whole life, she talks about how worried she is about losing her loved ones, especially her children, and how she's scared about the fact that, especially MLK Jr., has such a profile and there's all these people threatening him. This worries her so much that at times doctors have to put her on bed rest because she's stressing herself out so much, imagining what could happen. So I can imagine that when she hears the news that her worst fear has become reality, she falls apart, a little bit. And it's not just this moment of strength. I'm sure the strength was a part of it, but that she also is so heartbroken that her
Mhm.
children have been robbed from her. And she sees this as a moment to further protect her family members, to further think about protecting her husband, protecting her daughter who's still alive, and the grandchildren who now do not have either of their fathers. So this is important to pay attention to the balance of, yes, some way she found to move forward, especially with her faith, their Christian faith, and saying, God called my sons to do this. But she also experiences very, very deep pain and grief, And we can't forget that part of it. With Louise Little, we have to mention some of the context with her as well. Before Malcolm is assassinated, she herself has been put away against her will in an institution for around 25 years. And this is a result of right after her husband is murdered, a white male physician is sent to evaluate her because she's resistant to welfare workers entering her home. And he concludes that she's experiencing dementia. And he cites in his doctor's note that she is, quote, imagining being discriminated against. This is enough for her to be put in an institution against her will for 25 years. Her children are advocating for her to be released. This is more her two eldest children, Wilfred and Yvonne, not Malcolm as much, because he doesn't believe that, he doesn't think that there's any fairness, in the United States. And so he doesn't believe that at any point they're going to release her. So he kind of compartmentalizes this feeling that he has around his mother and the loss, and kind of moves forward with his own work. But her other children are able to have her released finally from the institution, and only a year after that. So she has a reunion with all her children. She gets to see Malcolm. He speaks about this with Alex Haley. And then only a year later, he is assassinated. So because of all of these attacks that have been waged against Louise Little for being this radical fighter and speaking so boldly against white supremacy, she does become more reserved in the last parts of her life, those years that are left, because she's been put through so much pain. So we don't have, again, any firsthand account of how she reacts to the fact that Malcolm has been assassinated. All we know is that she goes on to live another 25 years. Like you mentioned, she passed away in 1991, but she spends that time with her grandchildren. So in this case, Betty and Malcolm's children end up knowing Louise a lot better than he did, because he was taken from her at such a young age, and then he's taken from her again in this final way through this assassination. So her grandchildren also have done their best to protect her and protect her story. But they were able to share with me that she continued to teach them these notions of Black independence and Black pride, in the same way that she'd done for her own children. And she had 8 children.
That's very interesting. There's a lot of course, and there's strength and joy, but there's also a lot of pain and suffering in the book. And this story was one, I had no idea that was really one of the stuff that really marked me as well when I was reading it. Speaking of, sort of, I'm actually very bad at segues, but the role of religion in their lives, obviously with Martin Luther King, it's more well known. He was a Baptist minister, and Malcolm X, it's well known that he converted to Islam, and of course changed his name to X rather than Little, his family name, I should say. Let's start with with Baldwin, with Berdis Baldwin. I know also because I know a bit more, but I know of his relationship with his stepfather, David Baldwin, who he actually always referred to him as his father. I don't know if everywhere, but in most of what I've read. David Baldwin was himself a minister. James very much, although later on he would have lots of critiques and issues with the church and so on, but he kept the vocabulary and he kept sort of the rhythm, I would say, in many ways, of that upbringing. He was a choir boy and all of that. Can you talk to us a bit about, so this is what we know about his stepfather, but what do we know about Berdis Baldwin?
Yeah, and religion. Yeah, I'll say also that in doing this research, it may seem to us now that it's kind of an interesting coincidence that all 3 of the families, the father is a minister in some way, kind of different branches of Christianity, but that they were a part of the larger Christian church and their ministers. And it's less of something that should surprise us from that era than it would be now if we were studying 3 individuals, because in actually a book that is another recommendation, I'll say 3 at the end, but one that will come up, Righteous Discontent by Evelyn Higginbotham, she reminds us that the Black church, especially at this time, is the only space that Black people can organize, that they can speak in front of audiences, that they can meet each other's basic needs. It's its own society within a society. And this is why so many Black men take up these minister positions as part of their reclaiming even of their humanity. There's definitely layers of patriarchy there because we don't see women put on the same stages in the Black church as their men are. Instead, we see this kind of more background organizing and women taking care of everything and making it possible, but less in terms of being seen, directing and organizing. So this is why we see this in all three men. All three families were involved in social change, again, before their sons go on and do this on larger platforms. But that's why this coincidence comes up. With that, we also know from many of James Baldwin's writings that his father, stepfather, has more of a kind of rage that comes up in his faith. And he uses his faith to speak about white people as devils, and that, this is the perspective that he comes from. So it's very different than how Earl Little preaches about it. Very, very different than how Martin Luther King Sr. will preach about it. And then we also know now that he was experiencing some of his own mental health issues. And this will come up in his preaching as well. So in terms of your question, Berdis Baldwin also goes to church. She believes in the Christian faith. Up until the day that she passes, she's actually they celebrate her funeral at the same place that they celebrate her late husband's, a little church in New York. And so it's important to her to go to church. She cares deeply about that. But what she disagrees with is the ways in which her husband uses the church with this kind of anger, because she stands completely against that. She's all about love, acceptance, peace, finding the light. And we know that this is in direct opposition to James Baldwin's stepfather, who is much more angry. We know that he was very abusive, not only towards Jimmy, but towards his mother as well. James Baldwin speaks about the fear that his stepfather invokes in him, and how his stepfather wants him to follow this same path of ministry. And Berdis is much more, faith is about love, faith is about acceptance, faith is about finding the light. And so she's a very different character in terms of religion when we put those two in juxtaposition to each other. And I think this is what allows, in my opinion, James Baldwin to still see the role of religion in his life, but to not feel like he has to stick to this ministerial path. And instead, he can take from so much of what he learns in that organizing and oration of the church, but apply it to something that is different and that can unify people rather than, I guess, keep them apart.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You kind of see those two sides, and in many ways, Baldwin had both of them at the same time, depending on the writings that you read.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, speaking of the role of the Black church, I remember Baldwin sort of paraphrasing or quoting Malcolm X. This is in that documentary, I'm Not Unique, that came out a few years ago. That something like along the lines of like the most segregated hour in America is like high noon on a Sunday or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is something that Malcolm X would reference even after converting to Islam. So this is something that we clearly see the impact, or at least the importance of the Black church in that world, in that sphere, regardless of their personal beliefs or whatever. But like, okay, so this is Berdis Baldwin. What about Alberta King?
Yes. Alberta King is someone who, I think I might have said this, so maybe a slight repetition, but that her parents they established Ebenezer Baptist Church. So
Right, yeah.
Even in the way we talk about Ebenezer Baptist Church more generally, we have this wrong in our telling of history. We often say that MLK Jr. inherits this church from MLK Sr. That is not true. MLK Sr. and Alberta inherit the church from her parents. So this is a part of MLK Jr.'s maternal lineage. So she grows up going to church with her family, again, believing that through church, you can help to organize, and you can organize marches and boycotts. And it's all about kind of taking this vision in the way that she interprets it of the Lord wanting our earth to be just as equal as the way that God sees us. And they want to fight against oppression. They want to fight against poverty, making sure that there's more equality on earth, just as it should be and would be in heaven. So this is how so much of their ideals are from that, again, kind of space of acceptance and of love and of helping people come together, and be seen equally as they are in the eyes of the Lord. So this is kind of the notion of the King family, that Alberta grows up with. She holds strongly to her faith, but also believes that having faith is a call to fight social injustice. If you follow Jesus, as she does in her case, then you must also be against these evils of poverty and evils of oppression and evils of discrimination.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so, as for Louise, so her son obviously famously converted to Islam. That's an entire part of his politics and identity. What about her? What do we know about her? I mean, she didn't convert as far as I know. So, what about her?
There's little that we know, but I base my understanding of this off of something her eldest son said, in a speech that he gave around Louise Little. And well, he's talking about Malcolm X, but anytime he gives a speech, he reminds everyone that he couldn't have done it without, especially their mother. And so the story goes that she, and I just directly quote it in the book, she doesn't believe that they should follow just one religion. And so she kind of takes her kids, and exposes them to many different ways of believing, that he says something around them sitting with Buddhists and sitting with Jewish people and sitting with all kinds of different people from different backgrounds. It's a big part of Louise's identity that she's kind of what I describe as a global scholar. You know, she's born in Grenada. She's multilingual. She's around different belief systems all the time. She is educated in an Anglican school. So, you know, she has at least this background and an understanding of the Bible. She leaves and goes to Montreal, Canada. This is where she becomes involved in the Marcus Garvey movement. That is, again, this global movement. And then she, from there, is sent by Marcus Garvey, she and her husband, to different places in the Midwest to further incite this revolutionary spirit. But based off of what Wilfred says, she wants them to be exposed to many religions. And she even says, there's a quote, well, it's his quote, but he says that she said, that you shouldn't get too caught up with any religion because you'll lose your way. And you need to take what serves you from each one rather than thinking that just one of them has all of the truth and all of the answers. I find that to be really interesting foreshadowing, that she would say this to Malcolm X, and then we see how his dedication to this one leader ends up causing such havoc in his life. And I think it's quite fascinating that his mother was of the opinion that she might have even said, "I told you so," kind of thing. I told you not to only, believe in one and to kind of blindly follow one religion. So I find that interesting. I think it would be cool to know more about that, maybe in the future if her grandchildren were willing to share more about anything she might have mentioned to them around religion. I think it would be fascinating, but that's the extent of my knowledge around it.
Yeah, no, I really hope one of them do. But so okay, so we're coming close to the hour. So is there anything else that you wanted to share before we get into the book section that maybe I didn't ask or we didn't get into?
No, I love it. These questions are so expansive and very thoughtful.
Amazing. Okay, well, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why?
Yes, it's always hard for me to narrow down to 3, but one is called We Live for the We. It's by Dani McClain, and she is documenting her experience of becoming a Black mother and what it's like to raise her child in the U.S. and the kind of decisions she has to make at every turn that are controlled and dictated in a lot of ways by racism and sexism and classism in the US. And just this from a very personal perspective, what it's like to walk in this experience of Black motherhood in the US. So if anyone's really interested in that vein of things for the book, I think that's another great one to follow up on. Another book that I love and was very important to me in writing this is In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker. And she really touches on how we're defining motherhood in a much broader sense, that it's not only this biological motherhood, even though in this book I'm of course celebrating these three biological mothers of their sons, but also in the ways in which that Black women have given life through our art, through our creativity, and how reclaiming the lives of these different kinds of mothers is really critical. So she does this with Zora Neale Hurston, and you get to see her experience of going and making sure we're shining light on a genius that previous to her research had been left kind of, again, erased, and no one was paying attention to Zora Neale Hurston. And Alice Walker reclaims this mother figure for all of us. So that was really incredibly inspiring for me. But it's a book of multiple essays, and you get to better understand what it means to reclaim our mothers' stories, and that mothers being a larger category beyond biological motherhood. And the third one, if you're somebody who's more interested in fiction and kind of exploring these themes through fictionalized characters, I would recommend The Mothers by Brit Bennett. And she's the author also of The Vanishing Half. The Mothers was her first book. And it's just a cool way to explore, again, these kind of community mothers and how they are progressing the story forward through their commentary and through their advice to the main characters. And I think it's just obviously a brilliant book generally, but from the perspective of what we've been talking about today, gives you a step into Black womanhood through fictional characters.
Amazing. I'll just say, as a last point, that there is a fun way, or an interesting way in Arabic to refer to the six people that we were talking about, and it's through the relationship between the mother and the son. So one way, for example, would be, if I'm talking about James Baldwin, I can say he is Ibn Berdis, a direct link. Or for her, in her case, should be like James, essentially. And you can do this with the other four as well. So I hope, I don't know, one day maybe if there's an Arabic translation, maybe the translator can take my tip.
That'd be so cool. Oh, I would love that.
Well, Anna, thanks a lot for your time. This was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.